Hi, I wanted to add a few thoughts to the information presented in Chapter 15 on translation, including 3 vocabulary terms. The first is source text. This is the original text that will be translated into another language, so it's the source of the translation. And then the translated text is now referred to as the target text. It's the result of the translation. It's the source text that is now in the target language. And finally, transliteration as distinguished from translation. Transliteration means changing the characters or letters of a text from the source language to a target language. And you can see an example of this in the textbook on pages 280 and 281. There's a poem by the Tang Dynasty poet Li Bo, Drinking Alone Beneath the Moon. And we first see it in the original Chinese characters. And then we see a transliteration on the next page, each line of which is followed by a literal translation into English. And then finally, we have a translation that is a more poetic translation by Arthur Waley, a very famous translator of Chinese poetry. I also wanted to mention some different goals that translators can have when they're translating a poem. One goal can be to produce a literal translation. This is going word by word and staying as true to the source text as you possibly can. The second is to create a version that captures some of the poetry that the translator is hearing in the source text and trying to render that in the target text, even if that means that some aspects of that source text need to be changed. And then finally, a goal can be to create a viable working poem in the target language. And that's slightly different from trying to convey some of the poetry of the original. In this case, the translator is going to have a set of standards, what they consider poetry to be. They're probably seeing or hearing some of that in the source text, but they're really trying to create a new working poem in the target language. Often you'll see if someone belongs to a particular poetic movement or I'm thinking about the Imagists, so someone like Ezra Pound would have a set list of criteria for what makes a working poem in English and would then take the source text and convert it into a target text that represents those criteria. I do think it's worth considering the extent to which we can ever fully convey the meaning of a poem that's been written in a different time period, in a different culture, and in a different language, and really convey that in a different language, time period, and culture. But that's something you'll have to decide on for yourselves. It is a reason, though, as are these other options, these other goals, to carefully read the translator's note whenever you're reading a collection of poetry in translation. And that note might come as a separate item, often listed as a translator's note or a note on the translation. It might also be embedded in the introduction to the collection, but it's really helpful information to know what the translator is trying to achieve before we encounter the poems.